The woman at the center of this story never raised her voice once. Not when they dismissed her, not when they laughed, not even when the judge asked her, in a tone that was not quite unkind but not quite respectful either, whether she understood the weight of what she was claiming. She just looked at him and said, "I counted every stitch, Your Honor. I've been counting my whole life." Her name was Irene Vautrin. She was 47 years old, and for most of those years, she had been the kind of person rooms forgot about. Not invisible, exactly. More like the furniture. Present, functional, easy to overlook. To understand how she ended up standing in courtroom 11 of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice on a gray Tuesday in November, you have to go back 2 years. Back to a blue-collar street in Sudbury, where the winters come mean and early, and the houses lean slightly into the wind like they're bracing for something they've seen before. Irene lived in a narrow house on Pemberton Avenue with green shutters that needed painting and a vegetable garden that did not. The garden was the one thing she kept immaculate. Neighbors noticed it the way people notice precision in unexpected places. A little unsettled, a little impressed. Carrots in rows so straight they looked surveyed. Tomatoes staked with a carpenter's care. Garlic planted in October, like a promise left in the ground. She had worked for 22 years at Halliburton and Son Textiles, a mid-sized manufacturing company that made uniforms for hospitals and municipalities across northern Ontario. She ran the quality inspection floor. Not managed, ran. There is a difference. Managers attend meetings. Irene walked the floor twice a shift, her hands moving over seam allowances and collar stitching the way a pianist tests keys before a performance. She could feel a defect in fabric before she could see it. Her supervisor, a man named Bernard Ouellet, had put her name forward for a promotion 3 times in 6 years. 3 times, the decision had come from above and landed somewhere else. The reasons were never quite stated. The positions went to people who wore their ambition more visibly. Irene did not complain. She pruned her garden and came back Monday. The other thing about Irene Vautrin, the thing that mattered and that almost no one knew, was that she kept records, not because she was suspicious, because she was precise. It was the same instinct that straightened her carrots and caught broken seams at 40 paces. Every week for 22 years, she had noted in a small green ledger the production counts, the defect rates, the floor adjustments, the verbal instructions passed down from management that never made it into the written logs, not for any purpose. The way some people collect receipts, the way some people save letters, because information felt like weight. And weight felt like safety. And Irene Vautrin had learned very young that the world does not protect people who cannot protect themselves. She was not expecting to need any of it. Then came the audit. In the spring of 2 years before the courtroom, Halliburton and Son lost a major municipal contract. The company's response was to hire a consulting firm called Ashgrove Advisory, which sent in a team of 3 people in expensive shoes to spend 4 weeks producing a report that concluded the quality inspection floor was overstaffed and underperforming. The report cited error rates. It cited throughput numbers. It cited a productivity index that Irene had never heard of and could not find defined anywhere in the document. The layoffs were announced on a Friday afternoon at 3:45, which is when companies announce things they do not want discussed. Irene's position was eliminated along with 11 others. She was given a box and a severance offer she had 48 hours to sign. She did not sign. The company's head of human resources, a woman named Miss Whitmore, Bryce Whitmore, who had been at the company for 4 years and who dressed as though she had just arrived from a larger city and hadn't decided to stay, called Irene into her office on the Monday. "The offer is very fair, Irene." She used first names the way some people use courtesy, as a form of distance. "I'm sure you think so," Irene said. "There is genuinely nothing to contest here. It's a restructuring. The decision was based on the Ashgrove performance metrics. I'd like to see those metrics." Miss Whitmore paused. The pause was the beginning of something, though neither of them knew it yet. They were outlined in the report. They were cited in the report, Irene said. There's a difference. I'd like to see where the numbers came from. The numbers, as it turned out, came from the company's own internal reporting system, a database called Hallilog that the floor supervisors entered data into every shift. Irene knew Hallilog the way she knew her own hands. She had been entering data into it for 2 decades. She requested her full employment file under Ontario's Employment Standards Act. It took 3 weeks and 2 follow-up letters before the package arrived. Thick as a phone book, she read it the way she inspected fabric. Slowly, from the edges inward, looking for the place where the tension was wrong. She found it on page 47. The defect rate for her floor, as reported in the Ashgrove document, was 4.3% for the prior fiscal year. The document used this number as evidence that the floor was underperforming relative to industry benchmarks. The number had a source citation, Hallilog Quarterly Summary, Q2-Q4. Irene pulled out her green ledger. Her own records, drawn from the same system, showed a defect rate of 1.9% for the same period, not 4.3%. Less than half. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time without moving. The radiator clicked. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something it had already decided was a threat. She checked the numbers again. She checked them a 3rd time. Someone had entered the wrong figures, or someone had entered the right figures for the wrong floor. The difference was not a rounding error. It was not a methodology disagreement. It was 11 people's jobs. It was 22 years of her work, rewritten into a document that made it look like failure. Irene Vautrin did not cry that night. She made herself a cup of tea, let it go cold, and then she called a legal clinic. The first lawyer she spoke to was a young man at a firm in Sudbury who listened carefully and then told her, gently but clearly, that wrongful dismissal cases involving performance data were expensive, difficult to prove, and slow. The company has resources, he said. You'd be looking at 2 years minimum, and the outcome is uncertain. What would make the outcome less uncertain? A pause. Cleaner evidence. Something traceable. Something the other side can't reframe. She thanked him and hung up. The second lawyer was less gentle and said essentially the same thing. The third was a woman named Audrey Nakagawa, who had practiced employment law in Northern Ontario for 28 years and who took the meeting as a favor to the legal clinic and fully expected to say no. She was 61 years old and semi-retired and had a particular allergy to cases that arrived wrapped in emotion and lacking in substance. Irene arrived at the meeting with 2 things, the green ledger and a USB drive. The drive contained 22 years of Hallilog entries, her own export, pulled during the window after the audit when she still had system access. Every shift record she had ever entered, quarter by quarter, year by year. Audrey looked at the USB drive for a moment. You kept all of this. I kept everything. Why? Irene considered. Because data is the only thing that doesn't change its story when you leave the room. Audrey picked up the ledger, opened it to a random page, and read for 2 minutes without speaking. Then she closed it and set it down with a care that was different from politeness. It was the care you use with something that has just revealed itself to be significant. Walk me through Q3, she said. Irene walked her through Q3. Then Q4. Then Q2 of the year before. The picture that emerged was methodical and damning. The defect rate data in the Ashgrove report did not match the Hallilog entries Irene had personally made. More than that, the figures in the report matched the rates for a different floor entirely. Floor C, which handled the more complex contract work and had genuinely been struggling with a new machine integration. Someone, it was impossible yet to say who, had pulled Floor C's numbers and put them in a column labeled Floor B. Floor B was Irene's floor. Audrey Nakagawa spent the rest of that afternoon in a way she had not spent an afternoon in several years. She forgot to cancel her 4:30. She drank 2 cups of cold coffee without noticing when her assistant knocked at 6 p.m. to say the office was closing. Audrey looked up from the printouts with the particular expression of someone who has found something in a document that was not supposed to be there. I'll call you tomorrow, she told Irene. The call came that evening instead. I want to take the case. No retainer. We'll discuss fees after. Do not sign anything, speak to anyone at Halliburton, or throw away so much as a sticky note. What followed was the slow machinery of a legal claim. The filing, the response, the discovery process, the months of silence punctuated by terse correspondence. Miss Whitmore's lawyers responded with precisely the language lawyers use when they have decided the other side will eventually run out of resources. Professional. Mild. Completely certain. They were certain because they had calculated the cost. Irene Vautrin was a laid-off quality inspector from Sudbury with no legal budget and a ledger. The company had a consulting firm, a legal department, and a case file that, on the surface, told a coherent story. Underperforming floor, legitimate restructuring, fair severance offer declined. What they had not calculated was the USB drive. In discovery, Halliburton was required to produce the Hallilog data that had informed the Ashgrove report. This took 4 months and 2 court orders. When the data arrived, Audrey sat down with an IT forensics consultant named Marcus Webb, who was quietly extraordinary at finding the moment when a record had been touched. The Hallilog database kept a secondary log, an administrative layer that most users never saw, that recorded every edit made to any entry, along with the timestamp, the user ID, and the original value before the change. The data in Irene's employment file had been altered, not the original entries. The quarterly summary reports that were generated and sent to management, those had been overwritten. Floor B's figures replaced with Floor C's figures 19 months before the audit. The change was made by a user account belonging to a floor supervisor named Langford who had retired 8 months later and who no longer worked for the company. The change had been made at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday. Audrey called Irene the morning after Marcus sent his report. "Do you know a man named Langford?" "Raymond Langford." The line was quiet for a moment. "He was the Floor C supervisor. We weren't close. He retired, I think. He retired after he altered your performance records." Another silence. Longer this time. Irene was not the kind of person who spoke before she was ready. "Did he do it on his own?" "That," Audrey said, "is the right question." It was the right question because it had no clean answer yet. Langford was gone. The company's position would be that he had acted alone, without instruction, and that the error, if it was acknowledged at all, had been an individual's misconduct, not institutional wrongdoing. This was the gap between a provable data error and a provable conspiracy. The first was embarrassing. The second was liability. Irene went back to the ledger. She spent 3 evenings going through every piece of paper she had ever brought home. Performance reviews, meeting notes, internal memos she had kept out of the same old instinct, that low hum of a woman who learned early not to trust that things would be remembered accurately. She was looking for the sound the engine made before it failed. The wrong note. She found it in a printed email chain, 7 pages, from a thread that had been forwarded to her accidentally 2 years before the audit, about floor performance targets for the upcoming contract renewal. Langford was copied. So was Miss Whitmore. So was the company's regional operations director, a man named Callum Reese. 3 lines from the bottom of the chain, Reese had written, "The audit will need clean numbers from B and C, or we lose the contract renewal. Make sure the reporting reflects where we need to be. Make sure the reporting reflects where we need to be. Not improve performance, not address the gap. Make sure the reporting reflects." Irene read the sentence 4 times. Then she drove to Audrey's office and put the paper on her desk without saying anything. Audrey read it. Then she put on her glasses and read it again. "How long have you had this?" 2 years. "I didn't know what it meant until now. You saved an email chain you received by accident." "I save everything." Audrey sat back. She had taken hundreds of cases in 28 years. She had won most of them by preparation and patience. But there were moments, rare, distinct, a little dizzying, when the evidence lined up in a way that made the truth feel almost physical in the room. "They're going to say Langford acted alone," Irene said. "They will try very hard to say that." Audrey tapped the paper. This makes that argument significantly harder. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in November. By then, word had traveled in the way that things travel in mid-sized cities where industries are small and people remember. Several of Irene's former colleagues had come forward after the claim was filed, quietly, with their own recollections, their own timelines, their own small kept records of things that had not added up. None of it was dramatic. All of it was specific. A woman who remembered a meeting where the floor targets were discussed in language that made no sense given the actual numbers. A man who had noticed the discrepancy in a quarterly report and raised it with Langford, who had told him the system was being updated and not to worry. Nobody had called a lawyer. Nobody had filed anything. They were the people the system depends on staying quiet. Not because they were weak, but because they were tired, and because the cost of not being believed felt higher than the cost of letting it go. Irene had not let it go, and now they sat in the gallery of courtroom 11 in their work clothes. On a Tuesday morning, they had taken off to be there, and watched. Miss Whitmore sat at the respondent's table with 2 lawyers and a cart of binders. She wore a gray blazer and the particular expression of someone managing a situation, which is different from the expression of someone who expects to lose. Callum Rees was not present. His lawyer had filed a motion to separate his liability. The motion was pending. Audrey Nakagawa arrived with Irene, a folder, and her reading glasses. That was all. The hearing officer, a woman named Adjudicator Sylvie Thowen, had the reputation of being efficient and literal and impossible to perform for. She had been adjudicating employment disputes in Ontario for 16 years and had heard every version of every argument. She did not look up when the parties entered. Audrey rose. Audrey Nakagawa for the applicant, Irene Vautrin. The evidence will speak for itself, but with the adjudicator's permission, Ms. Vautrin will address the specific data discrepancy directly. She entered the records. No one in this room knows them better. The company's lead counsel, a man named Gerald Ferris, was already on his feet. The applicant is not a witness at this stage. This is an evidentiary hearing, not a trial. She's not qualified to speak to data analysis. She is the data analyst of record, Audrey said mildly, for 22 years. Adjudicator Thowen looked at Irene for a moment. Mrs. Vautrin, if I allow you to speak to this, I need precision, not narrative. Can you do that? Yes, Irene said. That's what I do. Thowen considered. I'll allow it. Within limits, speak to the data and nothing else. Irene stood. She did not look at Miss Whitmore's table. She opened her folder and laid out 3 pages. The Ashgrove report figure, her own ledger entry for the same period, and Marcus Webb's forensic timestamp showing when the Hallilog summary had been altered. The defect rate attributed to Floor B in the Ashgrove report is 4.3%, she said. Her voice was level and unhurried. The Hallilog entries for Floor B, which I entered personally, show 1.9% for the same period. The system's own administrative log shows that the quarterly summary, which is a separate generated document, not the raw entries, was overwritten at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday 19 months before the audit. The entries used in its place match Floor C's rates exactly, to 2 decimal places. Ferris stood. Objection. The applicant is drawing inferences. I'm reading numbers, Irene said. She did not raise her voice. The inference is arithmetic. Thowen held up one hand toward Ferris and kept her eyes on Irene. Continue. The email from Callum Rees, submitted as Exhibit 7, instructs Langford to make sure the reporting reflects where we need to be. The alteration was made by Langford's user account 9 days after that email. The forensic report confirms the timestamp and the original values before the change. She set down the last page. That's all I have. The room was quiet in a way that courtrooms become quiet when the noise of competing arguments stops and something factual is simply sitting in the middle of the table. Ferris spent 40 minutes on cross. He questioned the ledger's reliability. He questioned Irene's access to the forensic report. He suggested that Langford's alteration could have been a correction rather than a fabrication. He was thorough and professional, and unable, in the end, to put a single number in the Ashgrove report side by side with a Hallylog entry and have them match. There was one exchange that the people in the gallery would remember afterward, the way people remember the precise moment a balance tips. Farris asked Irene, "You've acknowledged that you cannot testify to Langford's intent. Isn't it possible he made a clerical error?" Irene looked at him. A clerical error that replaced one floor's data with another floor's data to 2 decimal places, 9 days after an instruction to fix the numbers, at 11:47 on a Sunday night. She paused. "Yes," she said, "that's possible." The room stirred. Someone in the gallery made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and stopped itself, embarrassed. Adjudicator Thowin called a recess. The hallway outside courtroom 11 filled with the low sound of people who had something to say and were deciding whether to say it. Irene's former colleagues sat along the bench by the window. She did not go to them. She stood near the far wall with a paper cup of water and looked at nothing in particular. She was watching Farris. He was on his phone, turned away from the room, his voice too low to hear. Miss Whitmore sat alone at the end of the hall, her hands in her lap, her eyes on the floor. She looked for the first time like a person who had been carrying something for a long time and was beginning to feel the weight of it. Irene did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been right for 2 years and is only now being allowed to say so. Audrey appeared beside her. "You did well." "I read numbers." "You read them in a room full of people who'd spent 2 years being paid to make them illegible." Audrey looked at her sideways. "That's not nothing, Irene." Thewin returned in 50 minutes. She read her preliminary findings from the bench with the efficiency of someone who had drafted them during the recess because she had already reached her conclusion. The data discrepancy was established. The forensic evidence was credible. The timing and nature of the alteration were inconsistent with clerical error. The termination of Irene Vautrin was found to be based, at least in part, on falsified performance data, which constituted cause for wrongful dismissal. The company was ordered to pay 22 months of compensation and costs. On the question of Callum Rees and the separated liability motion, Thowin noted for the record that Exhibit 7, the email, would be forwarded to the Ontario Labour Relations Board for further review. She did not say more than that. She did not need to. The gavel came down once, flat and final, and the room exhaled. Miss Whitmore's lawyers were already gathering their binders. Farris packed slowly, the way you pack when you're being watched and want to look unhurried. He paused at the applicant's table on his way out, briefly, correctly, and said, "We'll be in touch about the enforcement timeline." It was the closest thing to a concession his position allowed. He left without looking at Irene. Irene stood at the table for a moment after the room started clearing. She was not quite sure what she had expected to feel. Relief, maybe, or something larger. What she felt was quieter than that and more durable. The particular stillness of a person who has been carrying a truth through rooms that kept telling her she was wrong and has finally put it down somewhere it cannot be moved. Audrey touched her arm. Outside, November had turned cold and clear, the sky the particular sharp blue that comes only after a long gray morning. Irene walked down the courthouse steps with Audrey beside her and stopped at the bottom to button her coat. She looked up at the sky for a moment. Not dramatically, just the way you look at something you haven't had time to notice. "What happens now?" one of her former colleagues asked, falling into step beside her on the pavement. "I go home," Irene said. "There's garlic to plant." She meant it exactly as practically as it sounded, and she meant it as something else too. 6 months later, Halliburton and Son settled with 2 additional employees who had filed claims after the hearing. The Ashgrove advisory report was quietly withdrawn from the company's internal records. Callum Rees resigned before the Labour Board review concluded. His name left the door of the regional office the way names leave doors when things become inconvenient, quickly, without ceremony. Langford was never charged. There was a long legal discussion about whether the data alteration constituted fraud or negligence, and the discussion resolved in the way that discussions often resolve when the person at the center of them is retired and cooperative with investigators. He gave a statement. The statement confirmed the instruction from Reese. It confirmed that the word reflect had meant exactly what Irene had understood it to mean, and that he had known it at the time, and that he had spent several years trying not to think about it. Miss Whitmore left the company in the spring. Her LinkedIn said she was exploring new opportunities. Nobody called it what it was. Irene Vautrin went back to work, not to Halliburton. She took a position as a quality systems auditor with a regional health authority, reviewing procurement and production records for exactly the kind of errors that the system prefers to leave unexamined. She is, by every account of her colleagues, meticulous and unhurried and very difficult to mislead. She still keeps a ledger. She still grows garlic. On a shelf above her desk, in a frame that cost less than the paper inside it, she keeps one page from the Ashgrove report. Page 47. The defect rate 43% circled in pencil. Beside it, her own entry for the same period, 1.9%. In a handwriting that is very small and very clear. She does not frame it as a trophy. She frames it as a reminder that the gap between what is recorded and what is true is often small. 2 decimal places, 1 altered field. A Sunday night when a person decided that data was something you could adjust to fit a story rather than something you read to find one. The people who reviewed this case afterward spent a great deal of time on the forensic report and the email chain and the legal arguments about intent. These things mattered. They were necessary. But the case turned on something earlier and simpler. One woman who kept records in a green ledger for 22 years for no reason except that she believed, in some deep and inarticulate way, that what actually happened should be written down somewhere by someone who was there. Audrey Nakagawa has since referred to the case in 3 continuing legal education seminars. She does not name Irene directly, professional discretion, but she always ends the same way. She holds up an imaginary ledger and says, "The most powerful document in any wrongful termination case is not the one the company produced. It is the one the employee kept when she thought no one was watching." Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. If you had been sitting in that hearing room when Irene Vautrin stood up at the applicant's table, a soft-spoken woman in a sensible coat, no legal degree, no firm behind her, nothing but a USB drive and a green notebook. Would you have believed her? Or would you have looked at the company lawyers and their cart of binders and quietly decided they probably had the better case? Think about it, because most of us would have looked at the binders. And the reason Irene won is that she spent 22 years not caring what anyone looked at. She cared what was true. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the people the room forgot and the records they kept, you know where to find them.